In 1974, while putting together a book of historical documents about Black American life, an editor in New York found a newspaper clipping from 1856. It was about a woman named Margaret Garner, an enslaved mother who escaped across the Ohio River with her 4 children, and who, when the slave catchers finally caught up with her, picked up a knife and killed her own 2-year-old daughter rather than let the child be taken back into slavery. The editor read it once. She didn't forget it. 13 years later, she turned that single clipping into one of the most devastating novels in American literature. That editor's name was Toni Morrison. That novel was called Beloved. This isn't really a story about a ghost story, even though the book has one. It's a story about a writer who took an act almost too painful to comprehend and spent over a decade figuring out how to hold it steady enough to write it down. By the mid-1970s, Toni Morrison already had 2 published novels behind her, The Bluest Eye and Sula. But her main job wasn't writing fiction. She was a senior editor at Random House in New York, one of the only Black women in publishing at that level. And part of her work involved compiling The Black Book, an unconventional scrapbook-style anthology of documents, photographs, songs, and newspaper clippings tracing 300 years of Black life in America. It was during that research, sorting through archival material, that she came across an 1856 newspaper account of a woman named Margaret Garner. Garner had escaped slavery in Kentucky with her husband and children, crossing the frozen Ohio River into free territory. When slave catchers cornered the family in a relative's house in Cincinnati, Garner made a choice that almost no one who has never lived under slavery can fully imagine making. She killed her young daughter and tried to kill her other children rather than watch them be dragged back into bondage. She survived. Her daughter did not. Morrison included a version of that clipping in The Black Book in 1974, and then, for years, she simply carried the story with her, unable to shake it and equally unsure how to approach it as fiction. She later said that she deliberately chose not to dig deeply into the historical record of what actually happened to Margaret Garner, the court records, the newspaper accounts of her trial. She didn't want to be constrained by the facts of one woman's specific case. What she wanted, instead, was to imagine the interior life behind an act like that, the psychological and emotional world of a mother capable of doing something so devastating out of something that was, in its own terrifying way, an act of love and protection. For years, that idea sat unfinished. Morrison had a full-time job editing other writers' books during the day, and she was also raising 2 sons largely on her own. Her writing time had to be carved out before everything else. She developed a routine of waking before dawn, often around 5 or 4 in the morning, to write in the quiet hours before her sons woke up and before she had to leave for the office. Beloved, like her other novels of that period, was built almost entirely inside those narrow, protected hours before the rest of the day began. By the early 1980s, Morrison had left her editing job to write full-time, but the difficulty of the material didn't get easier just because she had more hours in the day. Writing convincingly from inside the psychological experience of slavery, and specifically inside the mind of a mother who had made that choice, required her to sit, deliberately, inside forms of pain that most fiction simply doesn't attempt to enter. She later described the writing process as something that required total immersion, almost a kind of possession. She said she needed to feel that the characters were, in some sense, present with her, guiding what she wrote, because the material was too enormous and too painful to approach purely through outside research and craft alone. The novel that emerged wasn't a straightforward historical retelling of Margaret Garner's case. Morrison changed the setting, the details, the aftermath. In the novel, the mother, renamed Seth, succeeds in killing her daughter, and years later, in a small house in post-war Ohio, is haunted, literally, by the ghost of that same child, who eventually returns in the physical form of a mysterious young woman calling herself Beloved. Morrison wasn't interested in writing a redemptive story about survival that made the horror easier to sit with. She wanted the reader to feel the weight of an impossible choice from the inside and to understand that the haunting in the novel wasn't just a literary device. It was, in her own words, a way of representing something that doesn't simply end when the physical violence stops. The trauma of slavery, she was arguing through the structure of the book itself, doesn't stay in the past. It moves into houses. It moves into families. It waits. Beloved was published in 1987. It was almost immediately recognized as an extraordinary achievement, but it also became the center of a genuine controversy within the literary world. That same year, it was passed over for the National Book Award, a decision that struck many writers and critics as a significant snub for a book already being called a landmark of American literature. In January 1988, in a direct and public response, 48 Black writers and critics signed an open letter published in the New York Times protesting what they saw as a systematic failure by the literary establishment to properly honor Morrison's work over the course of her career. It was an unusually forceful and public act of collective advocacy from a group of established literary figures, and it made the debate around the novel a matter of open national discussion, not just quiet critical opinion. A few months later, in 1988, Beloved won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Morrison would go on, 5 years later, in 1993, to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, becoming the first Black woman in history to receive it, with the Nobel Committee specifically citing novels, Beloved chief among them, that gave, in their words, life to an essential aspect of American reality. Here's the fact that stays with you. Margaret Garner read a single newspaper clipping about Margaret Garner in 1974, and it took her 13 years alongside a full-time editing career and raising 2 children largely alone, waking before dawn in borrowed hours, to figure out how to turn that fragment into a novel capable of carrying its full weight. She wasn't simply telling a historical story. She was trying to give a name and an interior life to a woman history had reduced to a single, horrifying newspaper paragraph. A woman whose actual thoughts and feelings in that Cincinnati house were never recorded anywhere at all. Margaret Garner herself was recaptured, tried not for murder but for the destruction of property, because under the law of her time, her own child had never been considered a person she had the right to protect. She was eventually returned to slavery and died in captivity a few years later. Morrison couldn't change what happened to the real Margaret Garner, but through Seth, through Beloved, she gave that unrecorded interior life a permanent place in American literature, 13 years after a single clipping refused to let her look away. What does it mean to spend over a decade learning how to carry a story that painful before you're finally ready to write it down? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one of them. And if this is the kind of story you want to keep hearing, the real story, the human story behind the books that changed everything, subscribe. There are more of these. There always are.